Hello, all, and welcome to Bennis Stories, a series of interviews with people who knew, loved, were influenced by, worked with, wrote with, were students and mentees of Warren Bennis. This is Kate Bennis, Warren's daughter. This series is created for the Warren Bennis Leadership Institute at the University of Cincinnati's Lindner College of Business. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Charles Handy. Full confession, Charles is one of my most beloved people. He and his wife, Elizabeth, took my father in when he had a life-threatening heart attack in London and could not return home to Aspen for many months. This was 1979. So my parents lived with the Handys. At that time, they were living in the wall of Windsor Castle. It was called the Cloisters because Charles ran the Queen's Conference Center, St. George's, at the time. And their son, Scott, was singing in the choir every evening for Evensong. His daughter, Kate, and I became fast and lifelong friends, although we'd known each other probably as babies, but we didn't really remember each other. But that experience of living there gave us time to skateboard around the castle walls and become close. Both Scott and Kate, their partners and children, are my extended family. In fact, Charles officiated my wedding with Hal, so Hal and I thank him every anniversary. An oil executive turned academic and in a glorious third career, populist social philosopher. Handy was born in Ireland and studied at Oxford University. He then worked for Shell and studied at MIT with Warren Bennis, Chris Argyris, and Edgar Schein. Handy launched and ran the Sloan program at London Business School, where he became a professor. He considers himself an Irish author-philosopher specializing in organizational behavior and management. Among the ideas he advanced are the portfolio career and the Shamrock organization. For many years, he did a 5-minute radio show on the BBC with thoughts for the day. Dad was really jealous of that, and he wanted to do something like that, and he adored Charles. And he was also a little bit competitive with Charles around speaking because Charles is an extraordinary speaker. He memorized every single word and still is memorizing poetry till this day, and you'll hear a little bit of that poetry in this conversation we had. And so he delivered his talks without notes, looking at the audience as if it was extemporaneous. He has been rated among the Thinkers 50, a private list of the most influential living management thinkers. He has many, many books: Understanding Organizations, Gods of Management, The Future of Work, The Age of Unreason, The Age of Paradox, Beyond Certainty, The Hungry Spirit, New Alchemists, The Elephant and the Flea, A Journey Through Tea with his wife Elizabeth Handy, and Reinvented Lives in the Second Curve. There are just so many, I can't mention them all. I am so delighted to have you join me and Charles in this conversation.
We thought so similarly about life that I can't really distinguish his thoughts from my thoughts.
I know. Isn't that funny? These are the questions I wanted to start with. And a lot of it has to do with how you influenced each other, because as human beings, we are always teaching each other and learning from each other.
If you agree, I want to tell a slightly negative story about your father.
Of course.
It's very important to me.
Tell me.
Well, at some stage, with a group of friends, he was saying how problems he was having running the university at Cincinnati.
Yes.
One of his friends said, I don't know who it was, it might have been Chris Argyris, said, Warren, the trouble with you is you want to talk a lot about leadership. You don't want to do it, which is very pertinent for me because it's exactly my problem.
Do you think that was true of Dad?
I don't know.
Do you think he wanted to talk about it and write about it, but he didn't want to do it?
Well, this is where I get confused because we think alike. I mean, doing it is so hurtful. You have to, make alliances that exclude your friends, and you have to.
Yeah. Did you feel that way at St. George's?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think Dad was aware of that. And I didn't know as Chris Argyris had said that. He told that story because it's when he left the university, right? He was able to leave saying, I don't want to do this. So tell me, how did you meet Dad and what was your first impression?
I'll tell you about the wonderful drinks party he gave for us.
Yes, tell me.
And your mother walked around with a whole lot of paper cups and a bottle of champagne in one hand and a saucepan of cabbage soup in the other, asking people which they would prefer. And I thought, hi, I'm going to like this couple.
So you'd come to do a PhD, is that it, at MIT?
I had a visiting fellowship there to
Ah,
study how they designed the Sloan Fellows mid-management career program. I was coming over to observe it because I was going to go back to London and start the same thing with money from the Sloan Foundation.
were you teaching at all when you were at MIT?
No, Peter Gill was the director of the Sloan program, and I was going to do his job back in London. So he said, the best thing you can do is to go on the program if you want to find out about it. And so I became a Sloan Fellow
Ah,
for 4 years.
4 years. I didn't realize it was that long. 4 years. Wow.
I suppose it was 3 years, but my bit was a bit before and a bit afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
I got another degree at the end of it, which was useful.
Yes. What did you do with Dad? What were you doing with your time together? Were you collaborating?
He was meant to be supervising my bit of research, but really we were just talking together. I started going to his lecture around Cambridge. He was talking at various places. Eventually he said to me, there's no point in going to another lecture, they're all the same. But of course, they weren't all the same. They all differed depending on the audiences.
Do you remember what he was talking about in these lectures?
Oh, I've lost you again. Well, it's the same old stuff, leadership.
Did you think about leadership differently back then? This was what, 1963, 4?
Well, I hadn't thought about it much. I mean, I suppose like most people at that time, that age, leadership, the only model we had was the army.
Right.
Command and control, being heroic and leading your men from the front and so on.
And is that what you
thought about it, to be honest? And
was it really thought of as leadership then, or was it thought of as organizational development, or
it was part of the organization development, yes. Mm. I went on one of these long OD courses up in Maine.
In Bethel, Maine?
Bethel, Maine, yes.
The T groups?
T groups, yes.
You did that.
I did that. I did a big one.
Tell me about it. What did you learn there? What was it like, first of all?
Well, it was very strange. Warren was in charge. It was after I'd been there about a week at MIT. Indeed, I'd only been in America for 10 days, I think. At one stage, after we'd been chatting away about nothing much, just gossiping really, how we were feeling, Warren said, now you've all had some experience of each other. Why don't we take a piece of paper, write your name at the top, and pass it round, and everybody write one word saying how you come across.
Oh, boy.
And then fold it over and pass it round. And eventually a piece of paper came back to me with 15 comments from all the people around the table. And they were awful. They said, snob, arrogant, toffee-nosed, stuck-up bastard.
Ooh. Oh, my God.
They were all pretty nasty. And so I stood up and said, that's not me. I'm an Irishman. But, that stuck with me. I remember thinking, oh, my God, if that's how I come across before I've even opened my voice, I must make sure that people see the other side of me pretty quick. I must tell a funny story or be nice or something. So it was my first learning experience, but the impression you make on people first is very important. That was my first T group.
Sounds painful, honestly.
Yeah, but very, very thought-provoking.
Yeah.
I realized that it takes a long time to undo first impressions.
Yeah. Did you change the way that you walked into a room, or did you start smiling more, or did it change your behavior in any way?
Yes, I discovered if somehow earlier on I could introduce the fact that I came from Ireland, it helped a lot because people had a positive view of Ireland. And I discovered too that telling stories against oneself helps a lot.
Telling stories against oneself.
Yeah, yes.
What do you mean?
It's frightening to people.
Give me an example of a story against yourself, like where you're showing vulnerability. Wow. I think I would have been hurt, but it sounds like you were able to listen and think, okay, I'll move on. I'll use that. What else do you feel like you learned in the tea groups? I have a funny story that I remember Grace told me about going to pick dad up at a tea group, and he was on people's shoulders and with his shirt off, and like he was their leader, and it was like a game had come out of it, some kind of strange game. Were there any funny stories like that?
Well, the most frightening thing that I guess your father asked us to do is to stand in a circle and take it in turns to go around all the other members of the tea group and express how you felt about them physically.
Physically?
Physically. So you could hit them or pretend to hit them or embrace them. I don't think anybody kissed anybody on the lips, but they certainly hugged them. It was interesting.
Wow. That sounds terrifying.
Terrifying.
Sounds very 60s Esalen to me.
But these were all American men, you know. I don't think there are any women in the group.
Really?
So I was to go and express great these big hulking Americans. Physically, I mean, do I hug them? I didn't want to hug them. I was brought up not to hug men. So these are all very shocking but exciting experiences. We had to reflect upon them. When we came back, Liz went on the tea group in London. Nothing to do. Yes, she found it very frightening. Somebody there said, well, I shouldn't worry, you're so clever. And nobody had ever said to her that she was clever. So she's the stupid one.
Wow.
And as a woman, you've got to be smiling and simpering and so on. You shouldn't have to express your own opinion. It made her very strong, actually. After that, I couldn't stop her talking.
You know what's wonderful about that is that it reminds us just how profound the impact can be from a stranger, even.
Yeah.
Right? In relationship. Yeah. So what did you take from that 4 years in Cambridge? What did you take that you brought back to London? What did you think these are the important things that we need to bring to our program in London?
Well, I came back thinking that the Americans, they were all Americans, the Sloanes, a very narrow view of the world. I really wanted to teach philosophy to my 35-year-olds, but instead we constructed a book of, we called it Readings in Power and Responsibility. It would have been leadership, I suppose.
Yeah.
The first book they had to read was the Antigone by Sophocles in English. Here was a woman who was pressed with the threat of death to not scatter ashes on her boyfriend's grave, or she'd be killed. And she had to decide, did she offend the gods and her conscience by not scattering the ashes? Or does she stick to her beliefs and probably be shut away in a cell for life? So we would say to the group, can you think of a situation where your duty conflicts with your beliefs? For instance, you're asked to sell cigarettes to Chinese kids. Would you do it? Or if you fall in love with your secretary, do you declare it or do you keep it secret? Or, dilemmas that might happen in their own lives where your duty conflicts with your beliefs.
Where are the higher beliefs? I don't see them. I see all duty. Ethics. It's an ethical question that you were asking people to wrestle with. So that is really important, right? That the ethics of leadership and power.
Well, I thought so.
Yeah.
But just my reflection on the American group, they didn't seem to have any basic philosophy, really, basic belief in what was right. It was very much do what you're told in life.
Still, after World War II, and was this before the Milgram experiments?
Oh, yes. Well, yes, I suppose it was.
Yeah. I love that you're bringing that up because that is one of the things that every leader has to grapple with. Who am I here to please? Right? Am I here to please the stockholders, the customers, the workers? The storytelling that I have heard from my family was a lot about Cambridge and the time that you and Liz spent there. And I know that you became, although younger than my parents, became very close and very dear to our parents. And I always tease your daughter, Kate, who was born a year after I was born. I always tease her that she was named after me, but I know she wasn't.
You may tell me if you think you don't want me to tell this story. After Kate and before Scott, Liz had a stillborn baby. And the hospital were hopeless. They didn't behave properly at all. She wasn't allowed to hold it or anything.
Oh.
And they just took it away and they buried it. But a year later, Liz made a personal pilgrimage back to Cambridge, to the hospital, where she found the records of the baby. And then, with the help of a very great friend there, who is the wife of the governor of Massachusetts, she's called Barbara Walters or so, I think. They went to the cemetery and they found the grave. Well, there were a few other babies there too, but that was where he was buried. So she had to give him a name for the records. So she called him Warren. So Warren lives on in our family. He's a year older than Scott, or would have been. So we keep occasionally saying, what would Warren be doing now?
Oh.
So can I tell that story?
Of course.
Because that's immortalized Warren in our family. I never told Warren.
Oh, you never did? Oh, gosh, he would have been so happy because every time we had a baby, he said, I think Warren's a great name. Every time we were having a baby, he said, is it a boy? I think Warren's a good name. He was very disappointed we never named a child for him. He would have loved that. Oh, Charles, thank you for telling me. So those are beautiful stories. I know that you all kept in touch for years and years deeply. And then Dad had a heart attack in 1979.
Yes.
And had you been in close contact for all those intervening years from the 15 years later?
Not really. I mean, we knew he was in the hospital and we went to see him. And he was terribly worried. He didn't know how he was going to pay for this. And we said, medicine's free in this country, Warren. You don't pay anything. And he couldn't get this into his head.
Yeah.
Anyway, then he came to stay with us.
How did that happen? Were you thinking it would be a day or two?
What?
Did you think it would be maybe a weekend or a day or two, but it turned out to be months?
Yes.
Did you know it was going to be months?
Well, I don't know. He needed somewhere to go to recuperate. So he said, come and stay in our spare room. And then he wandered into my study. And there was this pile of notepaper with the address, Windsor Castle, embossed in red on every page. And steadily this pile of notepaper decreased as your father started writing to all his friends. And people to visit. But the most crucial visitor, of course, was Jim O'Toole, who came one day and persuaded him to come back to California and USC.
Really?
And so he faded out of our life for a bit.
But he stayed with you in Windsor Castle for months.
I don't know how long he stayed.
It was a long time, I think. And then you found him another place, I remember. Another little house or something he stayed in for a month, but he couldn't come back to because we were living in Aspen, Colorado. I think at first he was just too weak. And then after that, it was the high altitude, I think they said would be hard. So he stayed with you for quite a while.
Yeah, probably a year.
How was that for you? Although it was Windsor Castle, you were in the cloisters, right? In the wall of Windsor Castle. So that was not large. You did not have a large house.
Not really. It had big rooms, but there's only one spare bedroom. And trying to persuade your mother to come.
But she was there for part of it.
She was there for a bit, yes.
I remember they had a hard time.
Well, yes.
They were fighting. Yeah,
Well, it wasn't the best way to get ill.
I know.
Uh,
And that was hard. Yeah.
I can't distinguish my words, my thoughts from his thoughts now.
I think that's kind of amazing that you had a friend and colleague that you were so influenced by one another's thinking. Do you think that's the case?
Well, I don't know about my influence on him. But,
I can tell you how I think you influenced him significantly. I think that the piece of moral or ethical leadership and doing what's right must have come from his conversations with you. And I think that he also was very jealous of your daily 5-minute things on the BBC.
Yes.
Right? He wanted to be a celebrity. He always said he wanted to be like in our country. He thought he'd be a great talk show host also. But you had this daily 5 minutes. What was it called?
Yes. Thoughts for the day.
Thoughts for the day on the BBC.
Yeah.
And he loved that. Just to be able to talk.
Yes. Yes.
Whatever you're thinking about.
It was meant to be a religious slot, but I turned it to a sort of moral slot.
Mm-hmm. Was that fun?
Yes, I suppose so. It was terrifying. 450 words, 4.5 minutes, 1 million listeners. Their breakfast. You had to reflect on something happening in the news because you come immediately after the news on the program. And then it has to have a moral twist, or for most people, a religious twist, and they'd quote something out of the Bible, but I traded it to a moral twist. But it was tragic. I mean, one morning, I was going there in the taxi at 6 o'clock in the morning. My phone rang, and the producer of the program said, "Charles, you'll have to redo your thought. San Francisco has fallen down.
Oh.
There's been an earthquake." And so I thought, well, what the hell would God think about an earthquake?
What did you say?
I said, when people suffer a tragedy, the best thing you can do is go and hug them. And I can't hug them sitting here, so I'll bring John O'Neill, it was actually. It was a friend I had in San Francisco.
John O'Neill was a friend of Dad's too.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I tried to ring John O'Neill in. And eventually got through. Eventually, because all the phones were down. But eventually I got through and he was okay. He was about to go off to the wine country. So I couldn't hug him, but I could do something verbally. And just to say, "Hey, mate, I'm here. And if I was near you, I'd hug you."
Yeah.
My message to people was if somebody has a disaster that you know, go and hug them. Just reassure them that you're there. And so you can hardly call that a religious message, but it was a sort of practical moral message.
Well, it reminds me of the tea group where you were hugging people.
Yes, they were fun. And some people listened to them. My favorite one was I was doing it, and then a week later, the BBC rang me up and said, "We've had a letter from one of your listeners asking us to pay him £50 damages because apparently when you were talking, he was driving his car and you distracted him and he ran into a bollard with headlights and he sent us a bill for
it was your fault." Oh my goodness.
It was great fun, but tough. 450 words.
Yeah.
And you had to tell a joke as well.
You had to tell a joke as well.
That was my rule, yes.
Wait, so your rule was a story, a moral, and a joke.
That was usually a joke against myself, you know.
Yeah. Okay. I love that idea of the joke against yourself or a story against yourself. I've never heard that framing or that term for it. I like it.
Well, I met your dad in the corridor in the Sloane building. I was being sent over by the London Business School to find out about what this Sloane program was in the Sloane building at MIT. And Liz and I were walking down. Liz was my wife. Liz and I were walking down the corridor trying to find our way around the building. And we met this man who gave me what I later called the look. His look was famous. He looked at you with his eyes, and his eyes said, "You are the most interesting man I've ever met. I look forward to hearing more about you." And so I was, of course, mesmerized. And then he said, "You're English, aren't you?" Because he heard us speaking. And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, welcome to Boston." And he said, "I got some people coming round for a drink this evening. Would you like to join us? Come to my house on Beacon Hill." So we said, yes, of course. It's our first invitation in America. And when I got there, it was full of people, none of whom I knew, of course. They all went around introducing them to me, but their names meant nothing to me then. And your mother walked around with a pile of paper cups under her arm in a basket, and in one hand a bottle of champagne, and in the other hand a bowl of soup. And she said, "Will you want soup or champagne?" I thought, this is a quirky couple. We're going to get on.
Oh.
And, it all started from there. Afterwards, I realized, long afterwards, that he introduced me to all the important people in his subject area, which is organization development. I knew nothing about it, but I thought if he's in charge of it, it must be good news.
Do you remember who the people were at the party?
Well, there was Chris Argyris, there was Vic Froome, there was Mason Hare. I got to know them all very well in due course. I spent lots of time with them all.
First of all, can I go back to something that you said earlier about giving you feedback? Should he have asked, do you want feedback? Should he have waited to see if you solicited feedback? Was there a way he could have said something that would have been easier to listen to? What do you think? Or did it feel just like criticism?
I can't remember the specific. You can only get feedback from people whom you know love you.
Oh.
Please think positively about you, which is why most appraisal systems don't work, because you don't think your boss loves you.
So what would you recommend as a boss?
Did you see my boss was Elizabeth, like a director in the theater? She gave me notes. You took the story wrong. You talk too fast. You should go more slowly. You should not use that particular slide, etc., etc. And I listened carefully to her because I knew she had my best interest at heart.
Yeah.
She's being critical. She's trying to help.
Yeah.
But in an organization, when your boss gives you criticism, you don't think he's trying to help. You think he's just criticizing you. And it's very difficult to carry out these appraisals in an organization. You can take it from your wife. No, she gave me really good notes after every speech I made.
Wow.
And because I knew she loved me, or she said she did, I took them to heart. The next time she said, "I'm glad you turned out better this time," etc., etc.
So what can you do in an organization when you're working with a boss?
Somehow or other, you got to make your subordinates feel that you're really interested in their development. I mean, depends how your relationship has been. It's no good suddenly say, "I'm on your side," if all the way along you haven't been on their side at all. It very much pays getting on good relationships with your subordinates. I went to great pains when I was running the Sloane program in the London Business School. I would invite every student individually to come and have supper with Elizabeth and myself in our home and get to know them as a friend personally. And as a result, when I called them in for some critical remarks, they really thought I was interested in them. You have to invest in your employees. It's a long-term process. It's no good suddenly say, I think you're wonderful. They won't
Right.
believe that you've been saying it for the last 2 years. Your father never gave me feedback.
He never did?
No, but he never came to any of my gigs.
You spoke at his festschrift at USC. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And this is what I remember. I was sitting at the table with Dad because you got up to speak and you were so incredible. And you had the audience in the palm of your hand. You had memorized every word, but it didn't look like it or seem like it. You gave this beautiful talk. And then Dad looked down at his program and said, "What? They put me right after Charles? Oh."
Yes, I remember that.
He said, "How can I follow that? There's no way to follow that."
Mhm.
Yeah, it was wonderful. I remember that vividly. The other question that I have to ask you is really about your wisdom for leaders in this moment and what you think Dad's wisdom might be for leaders and leadership development this moment. Because I think you know that what we're doing at the University of Cincinnati is starting a Warren Bennis Leadership Institute using the basic tenets of his teaching and writing to help all of the undergraduates and graduate students learn something about leadership and good leadership. So, a big question is, what do you think leaders need now? What do you think Dad would say leaders need now? And what can we do to teach people leadership?
One of the most important things is that you believe in yourself. You should know yourself, because if you're not genuine, they won't trust you. And so the more you can reveal yourself to your group, to your employees, followers, the more they like you.
Mm.
And so actually being as open as you can and knowing yourself and being prepared to let others into your secrets is very important. It's no good standing on the platform and waving your arms about. That won't win you friends or influence you people. They've got to know you.
How do you know when it's appropriate?
Well, I suppose you have to watch your words. You can still reveal yourself a lot. The great trick is to reveal your weaknesses. When I was teaching at the London Business School, I used to tell stories about my time as a leader in Borneo when I was head of the Shell marketing company there. And I made some catastrophic errors, but the students loved it. They love it when you reveal your weaknesses.
Yeah.
And then we go on to say, well, what I learned from that was this and that. And I'd get them to stand up and reveal some of their catastrophes in their life, what they learned from it. But the more you can reveal yourself, I think, to your followers, the more they'll trust you and like you.
I love that. So start with that. And what I love about that, Charles, is that's very in line with what Dad said. You have to know yourself, that becoming a leader. So
and
what is
reveal is a trick.
Reveal?
And people like that. The better they know you, the more they'll trust you.
Mm.
And the more you tell them about yourself, it sounds very egotistic, but it's actually not. It's being very open.
Mm-hmm.
And then they start to trust you. So that when you say, go and jump into this river and swim across it and shoot the enemy, they'll do it because you've revealed yourself. But knowing yourself is a start.
Yes. What is the journey of knowing yourself? How do you do that? How would you teach that to an 18-year-old student?
Well, you have various tricks. One of the things I used to do was to say, imagine you've died, and you're 80 years old, and your best friend is reading out a eulogy for you. Write it. You could talk about your great achievements as a marketing director or whatever, but what this congregation wants to know is what kind of person he was.
Right.
So describe yourself as a human being. And now, this class here, this is the congregation. You are dead, but your best friend is reading out his eulogy of you. Up you get. And because they found it very difficult, because to imagine your death is very hard when you're only about 35. But when they did it, it was quite traumatic, because they really had to think hard about what aspects of their character they wanted to live on in people's memory.
And what's interesting about that is that it's not only reckoning with who they are, but also who they aspire to be, right? When someone's reading your eulogy, you're thinking, what would I hope that I had done? And what do I hope that I had become? And how do I hope that I'd behaved?
They felt much more self-confident at the end of it.
Oh, really? Oh, I love that. What other parts of being a leader do you think are important?
What would your father have said?
I don't know. I'm asking you. I think that for Dad, I think you're right. I think that for both of you, that was the biggest, most important piece, is to gain trust through your own authenticity and sharing. I think you're absolutely right. This is what he did in practice at UC. He literally gave students and everyone who worked for him a lot of responsibility and trusted them. So not only did they trust him, he trusted them.
Yes.
Deeply. He gave them a lot of autonomy. Dad used a lot of humor. That I know was a big part of his leadership style.
One of my major leadership roles was as a father.
Yeah.
And yes, indeed, giving my children responsibility for themselves. First time they found their own way home from school on the bus.
Mm-hmm.
A big day for them. The more responsibility I could give them, you could watch them grow in front of your eyes. Even little things like lay the table for lunch, and when we had visitors, I made sure that if we had distinguished visitors to lunch, our children were included. So they had to make grown-up conversation. That gave them great confidence. I remember there was a special scholarship for grandchildren of British Army officers who'd been to Eton, which would pay for half his fees. Scott's grandfather was at Eton, and he was a soldier. So Scott qualified, but in order to get it, he had to be interviewed by the Board of Trustees, all these famous old men. So I took him down to the interview, and he was very nervous, of course. He was 9 years old. They said to him, "What do you think about the coal miners' strike, which was going at the moment?"
Oh my gosh.
And he said, quite genuinely, he said, "Well, Arthur Scargill said to me," who was the leader, because Arthur Scargill had just been to stay with us to talk to a lot of bishops at my Windsor Castle conference centre, and he always had breakfast with us. And Arthur was wonderful with children. He and Scott get on very well with lots of stories. And so it was quite true. It's what Scott said, you know. And of course, all these old boys didn't believe it, but he's got his scholarship.
Oh, Scott.
Now, one of the things I was grateful to your father was he introduced me to his speaker agent.
Ah.
Whose name I've now forgotten.
Was it the Lee Agency, or was it the Washington Bureau?
The Lee one, yes. It didn't work because, as he assumed that our objectives were the same, to maximize our income. So he got me running all over the place, from Texas to Indonesia to Malaya to Vietnam to wherever. And I wanted to go back to England and see my family. Mm-hmm. So in the end, Liz took over. What she did, which is very valuable, she took his contract form so she knew what to charge. So then Liz was much more creative. So she added things on. So if I was speaking in Nairobi, she asked for a safari as well. And in Calcutta, I was going to have an hour with Mother Teresa as well.
Really?
So all of these things she added on.
Isn't that great? And then she traveled with you.
Yes, she traveled with me. And I mean, we weren't trying to maximize interest. We
Right.
were have a good time. And
Exactly.
when
Yeah.
traveling around, I'm a storyteller. I just tell stories, most of which are true, but some of which I make up. And most of them about me, really, because even about my family, because I could tell lots of things about leadership just from talking about my family and trying to get them to do things and so on.
Where do you think you learned the most about leadership? Was it during your time in India or after?
I learned most by talking about it.
Hmm.
I mean, teachers learn more than their students. Trying to make out my ideas was how I learned, really. You know, your father learned by watching leaders in practice. I learned a lot by just reading history, really.
Hmm.
A lot of biographies rather than meeting them in person. I read about them. I made up stories about myself, how on earth I tried to influence people and so on. So my stories about myself were always failures, but audiences love you talking about your failures. But the thing I was most keen about was words, really. I feel very strongly that leaders have to be able to express what they want in words that make sense and rouse people. So I used to quote from Churchill and John Kennedy and so on, who have made words work to dance to their tunes. Sort of after the Battle of Britain, never have so many owed so much to so few. It's just very few words, but it's quite important.
Isn't that an incredible sentence? Oof. Yes.
So I think leaders need to articulate what they believe in. And so they've got to speak well, but of course, sometimes it doesn't work.
The words are important. And selfishly, I want to hear because I'm somebody who coaches people on how they deliver the words. Do you think the performance of the words is important? How they're said is important? You've got an actor for a son.
He produces me, directs me occasionally. If I do a Zoom talk, he sits there and directs me. I remember saying this to you before, and you didn't agree, but I learn it all by heart. And that way I can look the audience in the face.
Mm-hmm.
I can speak. They think I'm making it all up, but actually I've learned it by heart. But they think I'm just speaking off the top of my head. I think I learned it all from my father, who was a preacher. Not that he was very eloquent, but he managed to tell the right stories. I'm a storyteller, basically. I lie in bed learning it by heart, which I know you don't agree with me, but if
Well, I think there are very few people like Charles Handy. I think most people, if it's memorized, will sound very memorized. Their cadence will be very regular. They're not going to be very expressive because they're going to be trying to remember the right word. Whereas you are like a professional actor.
last paragraph, because you need to look the audience in the face.
Mm-hmm.
You need to feel it's coming from you, not from your bald head as you look down at your script.
Absolutely. Well, very few are able to do it that way. Mark Twain said, actors are the only people who spend 3 weeks to look spontaneous.
I know David Cameron became chairman of the Conservative Party in Britain because at the sort of selection meeting, he got up and he spoke without notes for half an hour, and everybody said, "Wow!" And I thought, "What do you mean, wow? I do that every day, but
It's rare.
you can do it. It does work like a charm because people think you're just speaking on the top of your head, but actually you're talking from the inside of your head. You've learnt it by heart, and you've practiced it. Once I get going, it's quite powerful. I nearly always get a standing ovation when I speak, but just because it comes gushing out, and
Mm-hmm.
but not many people can do that, I know. When we were talking about leadership, I think the way leaders talk on important occasions is very important, as was shown and as John F. Kennedy showed and so on. So words matter, actually, and how you deliver them matters. That's what you teach, but they really are important. You can move people. And I think what's the thing that leaders have to do? Of course, they do it by their example, but they also do it by speaking. I know Attlee was asked, Attlee was the next prime minister after the war. And he was asked by a biographer what Churchill did to help the war along. And Attlee said he spoke about it, which is all he did. Churchill made some terrible strategic mistakes in the Second World War. But what he did do, he spoke about it. Never have, in the history of humankind, never has so much been owed by so many to so few about the Battle of Britain, and looked as if Hitler was going to be invading, and he came forth and he said, "We shall fight on the beaches, we should fight on the streets, we should fight in the fields, we shall never surrender." All sort of good standard rhetoric stuff, but quite powerful. And rule of three, repeat everything 3 times in slightly different words. It really works. I had to study Cicero, the Roman lawyer, but also great politician, mainly because of his speeches that he made. And at Oxford, I had to endlessly translate Cicero into English. And I think I learned a lot from that. And Latin is a great language for rhetoric. And I think leaders need that,
Was there anything that you and Dad collaborated on?
No.
No, interesting.
Well, yes, I mean, I look back and I think, how on earth did I let him slip through my fingers, staying in my house and everything? We went to certain occasions together, but never to collaborate it, really. But I listened to him a lot. I copied him a lot.
You copied him a lot. That's interesting.
Well, his manner of speaking. I mean, he told stories. He told stories about people he knew, leaders he knew. He told stories from literature, from Tolstoy. I got known as the storyteller, not the expert on leadership, but the storyteller. But of course, your dad, who told stories about living people, he sometimes brought them into the classroom and interviewed them, which is very powerful.
Did you ever disagree with Dad about his thinking about leadership?
Well, the silly thing is we never really talked about it. Well, when you're great friends, you talk about personal things.
Mm-hmm.
See, here I was with the great expert on leadership, staying in my house. And we never talked about leadership. We talked about our wives and our children, but we didn't talk about leadership. But that's the way it goes. As I say, Warren was staying in my house, but we talked about breakfast and not about leadership. So I just read his books, really. I don't know if he read mine, probably not. Too lightweight, I think. But
no, he read your books. I know he read your books because we talked about them. There are 2 things I would love to ask you about that are personal and not about Dad. Number 1 is to talk a little bit about my favorite speech that you ever gave, which was at my wedding.
I do remember saying something, marriage was a good thing.
It was so beautiful. I remember when we asked you, so Hal had never met you, and he trusted me to ask you. I said, no, I think if Charles would do it, it would be the most amazing thing. And then when you agreed, you became very serious and you started giving us lots to do. Do you remember this? You were very clear that we were not going to be passive recipients, yes, that we were going to create a ritual.
Yes.
It was wonderful.
Well, I remember your dad having an episode.
Yeah.
And we were all terrified, but I mean, it was just the machinery kicking in. But it was quite dramatic. He suddenly went, he thought he'd died.
That was really scary. That was scary. And this is what I remember about that is that it was the rehearsal dinner and Dad and my friend Jamie Raskin were sitting at the same table with me and they were trying to figure out who was going to give the first toast. And Dad wanted to give the first toast and Jamie wanted to give the first toast. So Dad won. And he got up to give the toast and he was leaning against a piano. Do you remember this? And he started to sing and his defibrillator went off and he crashed. Do you remember that? He crashed down on the piano and then he stood back up and then he crashed down again. And then, of course, we were screaming and calling 911, and he was taken away, and it was terrifying, right? And the next day, he was fine. It had saved his life, the defibrillator. And he walked me through the field.
Just only too well.
And then I remember that he got up to give a toast at the wedding, at the dinner. He got up to give a toast, and people were afraid that it was going to happen again. And he started by saying, as I was saying. Oh my goodness. That was a beautiful event. Thank you so much for doing that, Charles. It's still, in my mind, the best wedding I've ever been to. But of course, it's mine. It was incredibly beautiful. I'll never forget it. Yeah. Do you want to end with some poetry that you love?
Okay, well, my favorite one is The Lake Isle of Innisfree by W.B. Yeats, which I love. I will arise and go now, and go Innisfree, and a small cabin have there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, and a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-lag glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the eyes of the morning upon a linnet's wing, to where the cricket sings, a midnight's all a glimmer and noon a purple glow. Oh, I will arise and go now to Innisfree, because as always, night and day, I hear lake water lapping on low sounds on the shore. I hear when I stand on the highway or on the pavement's grey, I hear to my deep heart's core, lake water lapping on the shore. That's all, lake water lapping on the shore. I got this image in my mind of this little lake in the west of Ireland, where I used to go fishing with my dad. I'd row the boat and he would be trying to catch trout over the back. Lake water lapping on the shore. Lake of Isle of Innisfree.
Oh, thank you, Charles. Well, I think I'm going to say goodbye today. This has been such a treat.